We are live.
Great. Welcome everyone to Connected Learning TV. This is the first of our four-part March 2016 series titled Youth-Led Inquiry, Connection, and Action, Redesigning Civic Education in the Digital Age. This webinar and this series of webinars over the course of March were organized by members of the Educating for Participatory Politics project, which is the folks that are on today, and also the Council of Youth Research. And folks from that team will be on the next webinar next week, as well as the one at the end of the month. If you're watching this, please take a moment to share it with your networks. And I'm your host. My name is Erica Hodgin, and I'm the Associate Director of the Civic Engagement Research Group at Mills College. And today I'm talking with Hwan Choi and Alan Linton, Sunita Sutova, and Adam Strom about how to support educators in and out of schools to promote equitable and impactful youth civic and political engagement. So we'll be talking together over the course of the hour about how to support educators to educate for participatory politics. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we're framing that and what that means for educators during our time together. So before we dive into our conversation, I wanted to go over a couple of quick details. So for those of you that are watching live right now, we welcome your comments and questions through either the Twitter hashtags Connected Learning and the hashtag Digital Civics, or the Q&A feature. So that you should see within the video player itself. And we'll do our best to address your questions here in the Google Hangout. So please add them as we talk. And this webinar is being co-streamed at the National Writing Project's educatorinnovator.org. And it's also part of programming related to Letters to the Next President 2.0, which engages and connects young people ages 13 to 18 as they research, write, and make media to voice their opinions on issues that matter to them in the coming election. So this webinar will be part of those resources, and I encourage you to check out that site, and it's letters2, and that's the number 2, president.org, where you can find lots of other resources and opportunities related to the election, writing, and also digital literacies. So before we begin and do introductions of everyone who's with me today, I first wanted to give an overview of our project. So we are all part of a project called Educating for Participatory Politics, and this is an action project that is based out of the MacArthur Research Network on Youth and Participatory Politics. The research network has been together for the past 6 years studying youth civic and political development and engagement in the digital age. And so these different research teams have been really looking at what does it mean to, how are youth engaging in the digital age, and what does it mean to really think about supporting young people with the opportunities as well as some of the challenges and risks. So drawing on that research, our project has been working with educators and also trying to understand how the research connects to practice. So we have been working together over the last 2 years to develop a framework that really outlines the core practices of participatory politics, and also to develop educational resources, whether that's curriculum or workshops or standalone lessons, to be able to articulate this new vision of civic education in this changing landscape. So we have been piloting some of these materials in the field with educators, learning a lot, and also then trying to sort of share out what we've learned. So we're excited to talk with you today about some of those things that we've learned. So in order to give a kind of framework of these practices in participatory politics, I want to just briefly share with you that the core practices that we've been focusing are investigation. And so by investigation, we've been thinking with educators about how do young people in the digital age learn about social and political issues that matter to them. How do they do research themselves, and how do they access information about issues that they care about? We also have been thinking about the practice of dialogue and feedback. So how do young people engage in dialogue about issues that they care about? How do they share their voice? How do they give feedback to leaders, to institutions? And how do they engage in sort of broader conversations, not only with their peers, but also with adults and others in the community? We've also been thinking about production. How do young people produce not only media, how do they produce ideas, how do they produce their own information? And then we've also been thinking about circulation. So how do they circulate that media and those ideas and perspectives in order to have their voices heard? And how do they circulate information that they've accessed in the sort of array of information that's out there? And then finally, how do young people think about mobilization, and how can we prepare young people for mobilization? And so how do they not only mobilize others to get involved in causes that they feel are important, but also how do they respond to people trying to mobilize them? How do they understand what those causes are, what the purpose is, what strategies make sense, and reflect on the best strategies to use in the digital age? So we have been, in thinking about those practices, we've developed an online collection for educators. And you'll see that link in a lot of the information about our webinar today, but I'll also just tell you quickly how to access all of that information. So if you go to the YPP Research Network website, which is ypp.dmlcentral.net, and then click on Educators at the top of the screen, you'll see that we have an outline of each of those practices and how they have always been important to civic and political life, but what's maybe different in the digital age, and what are the considerations for educators. And then we also have curriculum and lesson plans and resources and some blogs written by our team members, and also blogs written by educators. So there's a lot of resources there. We're super excited to launch this website, and we'll be talking a little bit about, when we're in our conversation today, some of what we're talking about will be highlighted on that site if you want to look at it later. So now I'd like to give everyone a chance to introduce themselves, and I'd like to ask everyone to briefly describe your EPP project to give people a little bit of context. And then if you can also kick the conversation off by telling us something that has been most new about working with educators to think about civic learning opportunities in the digital age. So let's go ahead and start with Jung, Hwan, Choi, if you can start us off.
Sure. Thanks, Erica, and thanks for setting the container, the frame for this conversation. I'm really excited to be here. I'll keep it pretty brief because I'm really interested in the dialogue, speaking of dialogue and feedback. So as Erica said, my name is Hwan Choi. I lead the Educating for Democracy in the Digital Age initiative in Oakland, California. And we're a district-wide initiative with the goal of addressing the civic empowerment gap, primarily thinking about low-income students of color and their access to empowering civic learning opportunities, trying to figure out how we can more equitably distribute those opportunities for those students. And this approach is something that we've often described as a hybrid approach, and so we have both an approach that is about pushing the civic priorities at the district level and trying to align with with existing district priorities in order to advance civics. And then we also support and program a lot of teacher professional learning around the very practices that Erica was mentioning: investigation, dialogue and feedback, mobilization, production and circulation. And so our professional learning brings teachers together around these types of practices in order to make changes to curriculum that we hope will be more empowering and engaging for students. And one thing I'll say about what I found really compelling is I'm always trying to think about how does teaching as a practice become less about practice, or I should say the learning for students, how does it become less about practice and more about and more game time experiences for students? And so if you can imagine the analogy of being a sports player and essentially being told, well, you never get to play in a game until you graduate from high school, you have to practice for the next 13 years. I don't think too many athletes would make it through 13 years of practice to finally get to game time. But in essence, that's what we're asking our students to do all the time is, well, just practice writing, or practice reading, and eventually you'll get to use it for something meaningful. But what's exciting about the digital age, and we've seen this in a number of cases with our teachers, is that it affords them the opportunity to bring their students into contact with real audiences for their work right here and now. And so they have that game time experience, or that sense of high stakes, real audience for what they're trying to do, their writing or their ideas, is available to them because of the digital age, bringing students in contact so easily with authentic audience. And so that, to me, has been where I've seen students really light up, where I've seen teachers really report that the practices that they're trying to engage their students in really seem to make sense and are worth all the time and energy that go into making those possible for them in the classroom.
Thank you, Hwan. Let's go to Adam Strom next.
If I can only unmute myself. Thank you so much, Erica, and thanks, Hwan. It's actually a great conversation, and one of the things I think you'll get is just the variety of ways that people have started to implement some of the ideas that you all were talking about. So I'm going to start with, I think, two tensions that were at the top of our project. I'm from Facing History and Ourselves, and we did a project with the Good Participation team at Project Zero at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. We did a small pilot. We worked with 2 different public schools in Chicago because we really wanted to see what it would look like when people started implementing deeply material. So what I'll do is kind of give you all a quick overview, but I do want to start with these tensions, which was, I think one of the tensions up top is thinking about the relationship between kind of teaching and kind of making young people aware of these best practices, of participatory politics practices, but also making sure that that would be combined with deep ethical and moral reflection, right? Anybody can start to mobilize people. The question is, what are you mobilizing people for, is often at the core of Facing History's work. And then also thinking about the role of teachers in schools, and this was really just kind of a finding out of the work that we did about the relationship between kind of getting kids to reflect and taking action. Because what we found is, there was a tension in terms of time, right, and how much time people had in the classroom. And we'll get at this when we start to think about what do you need to do to support teachers. But the quick overview of the project is that we recruited teachers that were in the Facing History and Ourselves network. They didn't have to be, but they were familiar with Facing History's framework, which I'm just going to show you y'all really quickly. And I'm not going to go into this forever because I think it would take too much time. But tell me if can you all see that? The screen? Okay, so there's kind of the Facing History's resources are developed around a developmental arc that starts looking at the individual, starting to understand the way that groups start to understand each other, deep reflection on history, and then ultimately ending in stories of participation. At the same time, we're looking for resources that are really kind of a balancing intellectual rigor, ethical reflection, and emotional engagement. And so why that matters is because what we were trying to do is build a unit that would start to pick up at different stops along the way in that scope and sequence. And so what we would do is there was the resources and the lessons highlighted stories of moral and ethical choices that were both on a personal level, but also some that were grounded in history, and some were also engaging on kind of larger social issues, all starting to get people to reflect on both what's at stake in these choices, but also the practices that people are using to engage people, or sometimes not to engage people, where people are frozen as bystanders. And so it's a unit, and you'll see up on the website there are a couple of the sample lessons that are up there, and it was a really engaging unit for a lot of these teachers. But one of the challenges that we just keep on thinking about is how do you balance, again, deep reflection about particular areas, so therefore when people start to participate, they kind of know what they're doing, right? There's some historical empathy, for studying in the past, because I kind of one of the conceits of this project is if you study decisions that are made in the past, far past or not so far past, that you're better prepared to think about your choices today. And what we found is that, as you're starting to teach people to do that and teach people the practices, that there's a little bit of a challenge to make sure that there's enough time to allow people to create their own student-led participation projects. And it raises a really interesting question for us as educators. Where do we want to balance our time? You know, on the student participation, or actually helping young people think about building the democratic habits that they need to participate? So I'll stop there and I can pick up more later.
Great, thank you, Alan. Let's turn it over to Sangeeta next.
Thanks, Erica. My name is Sunita Sutova, and I'm the director of the Henry Jenkins Media Activism and Participatory Politics project based at the University of Southern California. The project that our team worked on for EPP actually grew out of MAP's, that's our acronym, out of MAP's previous work, which was research-based and looked at several youth communities that really exemplified what we thought were really notable practices that bridge between culture and politics, and also tapped digital media in creative ways. So the project was very extensive in its research and came up where the book is, I have to do a little bit of a plug, the book is coming out in a month. But as we were moving through our analysis, we realized that we really had almost a treasure trove of examples of work that youth had done, mostly out of school contexts, and that we were constantly being asked to share these examples, to put them in dialogue with each other, to surface other examples, to share examples that we hadn't even come up with, but that other people were sharing with us. And so we ended up building a resource that's going to live alongside the book as it comes out. The resource is by anymedia.org. It's now available prior to the book coming out, so people are welcome to go out and visit it. And as we did that, we realized that this could potentially be really useful for educators. So we kind of came around to working with educators from the outside, because we started working with youth through their projects, projects that were initiated in schools. But we really did find that educators found a lot of resonance with their work, and the project we did for EPP was a close partnership with the National Writing Project, so it's all at home in the sense that this webinar is being hosted by NWP, where we brought our resource to educators and asked them to find in it what worked for them. So we really were starting to build from ground up an approach that would help educators use byanymedia.org in their classrooms. So what we ended up with were a series of lesson plans that educators come up with, which again serve as exemplars for other educators who would maybe like to go into what we call BAM, by any media, who would like to go into BAM to find materials that would resonate for them. What I will say as a surprising learning for us was the breadth of subject matters that the teachers and educators found worked. We initially had thought that it would really resonate well for teachers who teach writing, who teach media, maybe, certainly civics, because there's a civics focus clearly, but what we were really surprised about was that we had music teachers who found resonance with the material, that there were science teachers who were able to find material that they were able to draw on. And what this really highlighted for us was the ways in which all subjects, if I may dare say, are being impacted by the changing practices that youth are experiencing, and that digital media is maybe supporting, and that many teachers, even though their subject matter may not be civics or media, are actually finding that they have to somehow touch upon these topics in their teaching, and that we are really well positioned to give them resources or help them as they think through how they're going to do this.
Great, thank you, Sangeeta. And Alan.
Thanks a bunch. Hi, I'm Alan Linton. I'm a PhD student in political science at the University of Chicago, and I work with Kathy Cohen on the Black Youth Project New Media Research Team for educating for participatory politics, a mouthful for sure. Our project partnered with Chicago Public Schools, and in particular the Global Citizenship Initiative, to help support and run some modules in their civic education curriculum focused on bringing digital media into the civic education space. So we based this on 3 general ideas. One was digital media introduction, so learning about online sources of information, how to process this info, identify trustworthy sources and bias. Once you have that groundwork, going and thinking about the electoral process, so certainly relevant this year, but also in non-presidential years, learning about the issues and the campaigns and the roles of different spaces and how to get involved and be active and understand what happens in the electoral space. And then 3, center the conversation around policy issues. So this is the more action-oriented section, organizing around policy issues. Once you have the information, how do you present information, circulate information, and move towards action? We did this in initially five schools in Chicago, predominantly in marginalized communities, communities of color, thinking about the ways that digital media can be used as a tool to highlight and lift up and support communities that traditionally have been marginalized and isolated from the political process. In addition to this, we helped run some teacher professional development over the summer and throughout this year to help close some of the skills gaps and knowledge gaps around the different types of political issues, something I'm sure we'll talk about later on, and work with some young people around how to build their voice and activism through a summer fellowship that focused on research skills, multimedia production, organizing, and presentation skills. When thinking about kind of all of this work and the work of the other projects, the one thing that I keep going back to that's most compelling is when you take away some of the barriers and you put civics in terms that young people engage with, the level of interest and excitement about being involved and being active goes through the roof. So this means, giving young people some idea and some license over what topics that they want to engage with when considering elections or policy issues or content. And so young people engaging with unemployment as an issue, or the type of education policy going on in Chicago, or policing in their communities. Once you frame those topics and then you move it to a space where it's thinking about social media and digital media not as something that is banned from the classroom, but as a potential place where there can be growth and engagement and voice and action, young people, teachers, and community members all were very excited about the prospects of engaging with really tough conversations, but conversations that hadn't been happening with the same level of depth and energy in prior years. And so those are kind of the exciting touch points for this type of project and work that we initially started with 5 schools, but it's going to be expanding throughout Chicago Public Schools in the upcoming school year.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you, everyone. I feel like you all brought up incredible points that I'm excited to talk more about, so we're going to dive in. But thank you for giving everyone an overview and starting to sort of share some of the compelling pieces of each of your work and your team's work. I'd love to just jump right into the sort of meat of it and ask the question and have us spend a little time thinking about, we all know that teachers are juggling a ton in the day-to-day, but also in the sort of broad spectrum of their work. And really thinking about, I think many of you touched on this, but Sangeeta, you were saying, that teachers found lots of different ways to fit this into their work. And I think we all know that, especially in thinking about teachers in the school day, there's often not a civics class, or if there is a civics class, it's only one semester. And there's often not a class that focuses particularly on media or digital literacy. So I'm wondering, how did educators and teachers fit this into their work? What helped them sort of integrate this into what they were doing? What motivated them to integrate it in? And what obstacles and challenges did they come up with? What did they face in your experience? So I would love to jump into that.
Since you mentioned me, Erica, I'll just kind of jump in there and maybe get the ball rolling. So what we found, we didn't create curricula unlike some of the other projects in here. So we actually had resources that had pieces of curricula that teachers could draw on, and we brought that to teachers. And I think we had positive experiences. partially probably because of the teachers who entered into the program, so they sort of self-selected, right? So they were teachers who felt that that could work for them. So what we found worked really well was that teachers could go in and they knew what they were already going to teach, and they'll be speaking about that in a couple of weeks, and so they were able to pick pieces of what worked and put it into what they were going to do anyway, essentially. So, for example, there was a choir teacher who knew that she was going to sing song composition and then wanted those songs to be composed around a particular cause that resonated for the students. And so what she found particularly useful was going into our resource and finding a list of organizations that work with various issues and having the students research those and then write a song that would then be sent to one of those organizations, right? So that worked really well for her. What we did find with some other educators is that they actually wanted more of a prepackaged, ready-made curriculum piece. And we didn't have that to offer them. In effect, we did end up building a few more scaffolded pieces for that, but we did find that some teachers actually wanted a whole unit, and others just already had the unit so preset that they actually wanted just little pieces that they could plug in. And so we found the full range was actually needed if you wanted to hit all the teachers.
So I mean, one of the things that in some ways the argument behind our project, if there is an argument behind the project, was that you can teach these skills in a traditional social studies class, right? I mean, that's what we were working on, saying, you know, first of all, if you're teaching a social studies class and you're not thinking about participatory politics, something's missing from that larger material. But for us, you know, we knew that people weren't going to be necessarily teaching a civics elective. So we're going to try to find entry points from the past. And again, and there's this argument, and I really believe it, is that helping people think about issues at past and present actually informs participation today. You know, it gives you a lens, these categories, these practices, a lens to start to look at civic participation in the past. So, you know, the year we were doing this project is the year Selma came out. The film Selma, and you can start to think about, right, what were the activists in Selma doing, the folks at SCLC, what are the folks at SNCC using here, and so helping be intentional, using this as a framework to look at something that they're supposed to be doing anyway.
If I could just jump in on that point, one of the more amazing things that we ran into was there was plenty of excitement and energy and involvement from our teachers, but there was a difficulty in connecting to the issues of the day. So we had some folks that self-selected in because of the nature of the program. There were civics teachers, but others were from history classes, like Adam described, and they didn't know how to connect what was happening today around Black Lives Matter and some of the kind of organizing, let alone talk about this in the context of a complicated election with a number of issues. And so we ran into some teachers that were very comfortable with understanding and knowing and had great depth on the topics, but didn't have the necessary kind of new media and digital skills to engage young people in those spaces, and spoke often of young people being more of the expert in those spaces, and vice versa. And so there was no lack of enthusiasm among our teachers for wanting to do this and wanting to try it as something that would speak better to communicating the types of issues of the day. The difficulty was we had some teachers that were in different places, and it really put the onus on us after going out and sitting in the classrooms and talking to teachers about what do they need. And some teachers said, hey, I need a primer on how to be active on various forms of social media, so that when I give young people some guidance, that they can take it, but also listening to young people, because they do know more about what's happening in some of these spaces. And for other folks, it was, can you put us in front of a group of activists? Can you put us in front of a group of young people organizing and have them explain what they're doing, what they're engaging, what motivates them? Because if you put it all together, then you can have teachers functioning as a resource for themselves and others that want to try to do this in ways that one or two people on our end could never reach as many folks.
I'm interested sort of in building on something you were mentioning there, Alan, just because one of the challenges that I see working with teachers, and this is also potentially because I work on a district level initiative, and so we're really trying to work with everybody in our system, And when you put Black Lives Matter, when you put race on the table, and you say, or even if you just open the conversation to students to say, what are you interested in? Developmentally, this is a time in, high school is a time in young people's lives where I think identity and community, as Adam was mentioning, are incredibly important. So they're trying to understand group membership. What does it mean to be Black? What does it mean to be Asian, Latino? What does my race identity have to do with my political engagement? And so the challenge that sometimes I face around that work is that the adults are actually not well equipped to have those conversations. And I wonder if any of you all have experienced just like a willingness to turn things over to students, in addition to being like a fear of losing control of your classroom, also just like that the students might actually push the conversation in directions that you as the adult, or the teachers as the adults, might not necessarily be comfortable going. And that's been something that I've seen happen in our project in different ways, and I'm just wondering if others have experienced that.
And one of the things I think is so important, right, is I think all of us, or any of us, starting to look at this digital civics work, it's about balancing the technology but also the conversation, right? And are we prepared for the conversation, right? And so Facing History's professional development model has always feels it's really important to have teachers engage in these questions and these issues themselves. So when we're thinking about issues of race, when we're thinking about issues of identity, have we had educators start to think about their own response to those issues, right? And think through those ideas, because if kids start bringing it up and teachers haven't developed that comfort level with that conversation, too often important conversations get shut down because we're nervous about what's going to start to happen, and we might not be able to control it. And yet at the other end, you have teachers who are sometimes just so nervous about the platforms, right? That they're ready to have that conversation, but aren't ready to talk about it in a digital space. So I mean, we talked to teachers a lot about what discussion forum that they were going to be using, and helping people understand that technically. And of course, we all know that that's going to change next year. Whatever they used last year, it's going to be a new one, and it's going to be a better one next year. So how do we balance that, emotional engagement for the teachers, and then the technical proficiency? I think you all both were saying that.
I think you all brought up, some really very different but also very similar things that make me think a lot about in this work. How do we create time and space for educators? So not only how do we create time and space for educators to think about and talk with each other about the issues of the day, how do we create time and space for educators to think about identity development of their students, but also their own identity and how that impacts their positionality as a teacher. And then also the digital side of it. How do we create time and space for educators to explore and learn digital tools, and also just have that kind of dispositional stance of being open to consistently learn. Because I think, as Adam, as you said, these tools are going to change, and as Alan said, these issues are going to change. It's not always going to be the same issues. It's not always going to be the same tools. And how do we support educators to really be treated as professionals and also have that time and space to really learn themselves and to engage with their colleagues around some of these issues, so that once they are with their students in the classroom, they can engage in an authentic conversation. They can engage in an authentic process of exploring a tool or a platform, and really thinking about how do we connect the skills and the practices to the content and the issues and the ideas and the conversation. So I would love to hear more, because I think one of the really powerful things about this project, and what I have learned so much from all of us being in conversation with each other, because each of us is in a different context, and we all went about working with educators in such different ways. And I would love to hear a little bit more about what worked well or what was challenging creating that time and space for educators. So whether it be around the digital side of things, whether it be around them thinking about their own identity, issues of race, issues of social justice, whether it be about having controversial conversations how did you create that time and space, and how did you, create an environment for teachers where they really felt like they could take those risks?
Can I just add a third one to that conversation, Erica? Because I think you laid out, like, okay, there's the identity development piece and there's the digital tools, but I also think that another area where we have to support teachers, particularly when we're talking about these EPP practices, is if we think about mobilization. There are not many of our teachers come to teaching with a background as community organizers or as folks who use online tools to mobilize around civic issues or political issues. And so I think, in the same way that we have to think about how we support pedagogically teachers with these other elements, if we're talking about civics, we're talking about civic action, how do we also give teachers the opportunity to explore their own identities as civic actors, and their role within, particularly when we're trying to expand their conception of civic or political participation beyond voting and serving on a jury. What are those other practices that we can expose them to through the professional learning spaces, so that they begin to think more expansively about what civic engagement or civic action in the digital age even means.
Can I just pick up on that really quickly? I mean, one of the things I'm always interested in is how can we get educators to think about themselves as educators? So yes, you want them to bring their own experiences in the room, but they're also educators. And they're also educating a diverse group of students who are going to have their own politics, right? And their own ideas, and they're also teaching in school districts and schools. There's a different role between being an activist and being an educator. So, how do we also help educators practice thinking about both their own limits, what they should be doing in terms of participatory politics in the classroom? Does that make sense what I'm saying here? I'm not sharp. I was on a red eye last night, so be kind to me.
It's also late there, right? We're all functioning at different time zones.
It's the red eye, though.
But the flip question to what Adam was asking would actually be, he was asking about the limit. I mean, where's the boundary? And I actually what we saw were activists turned educators quite a lot. So people who were coming from the field of social justice, or who were used to affecting change, but also wanted to translate that into learning. And so we were actually seeing the other side of that. So the other piece of that would be, well, where is it about education, and when is it actually about furthering a cause? Because I've also seen in some cases where learning's happening along the way, right? But that's actually it's the campaign that's actually what's driving the participation. So I don't have an answer, but
that's what I was meaning to say. By the way, it's exactly that issue.
Sangeeta really brought up something that we saw as well, just from educators that had some prior experience, but didn't know how to connect the issues that they were very passionate about, or the issues that they cared about, with the issues of the day, or the issues that young people may be engaging or asking questions about. And so for us, one of the things that we probably underestimated was how much time we need to give teachers with the actual curriculum and allow them to use and finesse and edit it on their own. So we put this thing out, we tried to pilot it to make sure we got it into the field a couple of years ago, and teachers didn't feel like they had enough time. But over the summer, actually doing some of the lessons themselves, we started to get the questions that we needed, like, hey, there are a lot of different lessons here of policy issues and organizing. Can we talk to a community organizer today? Someone that maybe went to some of the same high schools that they currently teach at, that are addressing some of the issues that young people have expressed wanting to engage with as a part of the lesson, because they needed to get a sense of how are people talking about this? What is the language that they're using? Where are they going to organize? What is the groundwork that's happening as an entire skill set, so that they felt comfortable? And I think there was some expression of wanting to engage in this for folks that had previously engaged in these types of topics. And so for us, it was a matter of we needed to give teachers more time to explore and create and put their own personal touch at their school, because some schools we worked at were tech-heavy, computers, laptops in all the classrooms, and others were not. But what to close that gap was the matter of giving the teacher the tool of our curriculum that they helped write and support, and think about, here's what it looks like on the north side for this community. Here's what it looks like on the west side for this community, and allowing that kind of flexibility so that we weren't assuming that we knew what they needed to have. They could come back to us, and we could try to plug in the gaps. But it's unbelievably hard with limited PD time or limited time to engage. But getting the material as quickly as possible to teachers to tinker and edit was something that was really, really quite compelling and helpful on our end.
I want to just pause for a second and see if anyone has anything else to add on that question. I realize we put out this huge question, and then we have some questions that are coming through on the Twitter chat. And for other folks that are watching live, please feel free to add in your questions, and we will start to grapple with those. But just want to make sure that if anyone else wanted to add anything about how you create time and space for teachers to grapple with all of these things, I want to give people a chance to address that.
Yeah, Erica, just on the platform question, because there was a question around digital proficiency, and what we found our activists working through was what the title of our book, which is By Any Media Necessary, and we found that was actually really helpful in our work with educators, and helped us sort of lower the bar around expectations and lower the anxiety levels about knowing certain things. And we sort of said, is by any media necessary? It's whatever you're good at. It's also use it as an approach in your classroom, and also allow the students to find their own media that works for them. So focus more on the content, on the substance, on the audience, less on the platform, right? So it doesn't have to be Twitter, it doesn't have to be Facebook, it doesn't have to be Snapchat. It's about how are you going to get to know your audience, how are you going to be able to get your message out? And we found that actually really helped a lot in addressing that question around platform and digital abilities. Yeah.
So this is related to that. I mean, one of the things I think that young people are starting to learn when they start to look at a social issue, or I think all of us could learn, forget just young people, is starting to understand actually how do you match the tools that you're using versus kind of this is a concept Martha Minow, as the Dean of Harvard Law School, has been talking about, with the levers of power that you're trying to pull. So let's say you think about a social issue. And I'd say that this is something that's being done at one level. So what are the right tools to move the person up there versus the tools to get other people mobilized who might join you and trying to leverage that person? And I think that it's a real challenge, I think, for a lot of us when we start to look at a social issue. It can feel deep and overwhelming, and I don't know where to pull. So I think the conversation about which tool is really important, but it's also which tool versus what's the change you're trying to affect and where that is.
This is great. I want to just add in this question, which you all are addressing, but just to highlight, because I think this is a fabulous question that we've gotten from the Twitter chat, which is, what do you all think about educators engaging students on social media platforms or using social media tools that they already naturally use? So the example was Snapchat. So what do you think about educators kind of pulling that into the classroom and using it, pivoting that towards civic and political ends?
It's a question, I think it's a great question. It's a question that we've grappled with in different spaces in Chicago. Generally, when you have the infrastructure out there to understand what this tool is, we had very compelling and very powerful results in terms of getting student buy-in and student commitment over the long term to what's happening, usually around the lesson or the issue that they're addressing. So, one of the good points that was brought up was this content versus platform thing. It was not simply enough to keep students interested by saying, hey, we're going to go to the computer lab more often, or we're going to be using our phones in the classroom. That if it was just that kind of, faded over time. There was something special, and it gets back, I think, to your point, Erica, about the kind of gap between how much do you let go in terms of control and engaging students on their space. It gives them some sense that they're being heard in the classroom, that their expertise, that their level of comfort means something to the educational experience, to their growth as people engaging in the topic, and that ultimately this is a learning experience for everyone. So in this conversation around the principles that we have, the idea of dialogue and feedback, production and circulation, that these are kind of two-way streets, and to replicate that in the classroom space where students are comfortable allows a bit of vulnerability on the educator's part, without question, but an element of engagement and commitment that students can feel like, hey, this isn't just I have to sit here and do an assignment. I'm actually doing something that's that's worthwhile in a space that I'm comfortable with. In the same vein that there are some young people that may not feel very comfortable in the classroom space doing an in-class presentation. So it's that push and pull that we've experienced. But generally, Snapchat or Vine or Instagram, most of these now more kind of video-based organizing platforms that young people are using, mobile-based on their phones, those are the spaces that are getting a great deal of reception and feedback that's very positive. And it's now kind of fine-tuning that to the broader lessons that we're trying to get out of thinking about how you can leverage those tools for action, engagement, and participation in a meaningful way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanted to add to that I think one thing that we see in research that's really looking at how teachers and educators are using different platforms, and I would say that some of this research is focused specifically on blogging, that for many students, assignments that are in the classroom where teachers are trying to bring in online dialogue and talking about social issues, that for students, if the assignment itself is not connected to an audience, that for many of them it feels like any assignment. So even if the tool might be Tumblr that they use for other purposes in their, outside of school, that in school, if you're using that same platform and it's not connected to an authentic audience or connected to a broader conversation, then I think for students it doesn't, the engagement doesn't hold up for them. And so we've seen that in a lot of research. And this is what I think Peter Levine calls the audience problem, right? So, I think that what I would say in the same vein is that we want to set students up to connect to an authentic audience, and we want to set realistic expectations of also action. So not just sort of dialogue, but also, how do we connect students to these broader movements that are already happening and organizing that's happening in their community so that it feels connected to something in a more sustainable way. And at the same time, I would say, in the same vein, we don't want to set students up to feel like, if they put their voice out there and they're expressing themselves and they have, one comment, say they're blogging and they have one comment, we don't want to say that then it doesn't count, right? Because they don't have 100 comments or it isn't circulated to an audience of 2,000. I think, all of these sort of entry points are really significant, I think, for young people in getting their voices out there and taking steps towards action and reflecting on these issues together with their peers. So I think that there's sort of a spectrum of we want to set students up to connect to an authentic audience and at the same time be realistic and understand that entry points are significant no matter how big or small. I think the other thing that would be really interesting for us to think about is just some of the challenges, and not only for educators and how do they support young people around the sort of afterlife, as Lissa Soap has framed it, the sort of afterlife of this content that goes up online, and also some of the risks and challenges. And Sangeeta, this is, I think you can speak to this in your research around, young people being monitored and surveillance of content that goes up online. How does this impact young people when they're putting themselves out there? For various different reasons, either, what impact does that have on them based on their identity, based on their politics, based on their futures. And so I think, you know, it'd be interesting to maybe think for a few minutes about, and we're getting close to time, but just how do educators support young people around some of these challenges of the digital age? And, you know, a lot of the research has shown that if, you know, if young people don't have supports around this, or if they are fearing backlash, the Good Participation Project team has done some research around this, that many young people will silence or quiet their expression over time if they, you know, in anticipation of backlash or anticipation of some of these consequences. So would love to just spend a minute thinking about how educators deal with this and support young people.
So I'll just share an example which I think relates to both the earlier point and the point that you're making now, Erica. And we have a group of educators this year that are meeting around blogging and trying to get their students to blog. And one of the things that they, or some of them have done more intentionally to protect students from like the random comments that they might come across online is to use a more protected platform. And so a number of the teachers are on youthvoices.net, which is actually started by National Writing Project teachers. Imagine that. And so students get online and they're in a community of other students and educators. So the comments that they're getting are in many ways sort of being curated. Well, they're not curated, but the students are brought into a culture online of how to participate in that space. So it's not just anybody coming in and commenting. And so I think it provides a safer venue. But what's also interesting is that in this blogging group, they found that even students who were posting things in Youth Voices weren't getting comments. And so they engineered over the last couple months a common theme that all the teachers were going to write about, or all the students were going to write about, and then they shared the teachers shared the students' blog addresses with each other so that, you know, they could assign, you know, hey, you need to go read this person's blog and comment. And so, you know, the students were starting to get comments from students in Oakland from a different school, but it was like super exciting for them because like, oh, hey, they're getting comments, and so it was a way to both like address this issue of safety, but also to encourage the students because they were engaging with an authentic audience, even though it was behind the scenes, you know, engineered by the teachers to make it happen.
So what we did on the MAP project is that we developed a framework through which teachers could explore the public-private kind of dichotomy and do so in a way that doesn't, you know, try to keep people safe necessarily or urge them to take everything and make it public and to really think that everything is public today. So really to get much more nuanced about what does privacy mean in the digital age? What is the power and the challenge of going public with issues? And so we really work to introduce concepts like context collapse, understanding what audiences may see your stuff even though you didn't envision that, to really think about that and weigh the risks and the benefits of what you're going to put out in that context. So I think there is unfortunately there's no clear answer, right? There's no there's no yes, no, there's no checklist that you can go through, but we were trying to go develop a series of decisions that young people can go through as they consider the whether or not to post and how to post.
And just the one thing that Facing History has learned over the years is it's so important to help isolate those choices that people are making that they may not even realize that they're making, right? So I think that's so important. And your example of having the teachers of Oakland start to just share and comment. People sometimes are just missing good best practice in the digital world. So building, helping people understand what might be some good norms. And I think that's true for a face-to-face conversation, but it's also true for these digital conversations. And so just helping people have that safety and saying this is what a good best practice looks like. So this is how we're going to start to model a civil conversation online as compared to some of what we're seeing in the larger political world maybe sometimes.
Alan, I want to give you a chance to share any final thoughts since each person's had a chance to say one last thing.
Great, thank you. I think one of the more one of the big things that we've seen, and I think it's something to keep in mind, is that these tools are new and understanding them may be difficult, but we shouldn't get away. And one of the things that the educators really pushed us on was making sure we don't get away from kind of fundamental things that happen in the classroom that can apply both online and offline. So even with the previous comments about modeling what type of space that we're going to have, and starting off in the classroom, getting young people to comment on each other's blogs if they go down that route, and making sure the comments are substantive and positive, but critical in a way that's supportive and building that comfort. But in terms of kind of big picture final thoughts, overwhelmingly getting to the teachers. I don't do curriculum writing, Kathy doesn't do curriculum writing. It was getting to the teachers and understanding what are the spaces that we're about to get into in terms of educators' needs, educators' limitations on time, and they're experts in their own classrooms, they're experts in their own schools, and using that expertise to craft some supports around what they know and already do. In the same vein that we're trying to build curriculum, at least with our project, around what young people know and what they care about, those are some of the lessons that can really shape this type of work. And for those folks thinking about doing this outside of the civic space or want to doing this in different areas, getting to where the audience is that you're looking to engage the most, and asking them to be a part of the process of developing the types of tools that they're going to be using is invaluable and makes everything that much easier because they had an input from the get-go.
Thank you. Well, I really just want to say, how fabulous it's been to have this conversation. I can't believe that it's already 5. I have no doubt we could go on for another hour. So just want to thank you all for sharing your thoughts and your lessons learned and the questions that we're all still grappling with. I think, as one of you said, there's no easy answers for this. And so I just want to say this wraps up our first webinar for our series in March on redesigning civic education for the digital age. And I do hope that people will keep the energy up on Twitter. So please, keep the questions coming, the thoughts. And the hashtags that you can use are connected learning and also digital civics. And there will be a full video recording of this webinar available immediately after on connectedlearning.tv with other curated content and some of the links that we've all also been highlighting. So please check that out. And if you found this conversation helpful, please share with your networks. And please also look at the upcoming webinars for the rest of this month on Connected Learning TV. And those will be highlighted on the National Writing Project's Educator Innovator site and also on Connected Learning TV. So I want to thank everyone again for the conversation, and we look forward to more conversations the rest of this month.